Today's episode of the podcast features Nik Darlington of Graft Wines. A double milestone, this marking the 400th episode of Interpreting Wine. This is also the first episode I've ever recorded remotely in light of the isolation recommendations for COVID-19. Nik is somebody I featured in the early days of the podcast back in episode 63. And I look forward to using this platform to get out voices from within hospitality in the UK and around the world. Here, Nik gives us an overview of Graft Wine Company and how this grew out of his old company, Red Squirrel. He gives us a supply chain update. He talks revenue in the context of the government support for the sector. And we search for silver linings of this current situation. Enjoy.
Okay, well, the Graft Wine Company was formed last summer, so 2019, and it was Red Squirrel Wine coming together with the Knotted Vine. So actually, both myself and David Knott have spoken to you, Lawrence, in the past, separately, as heads of our separate companies. I think we're going back quite a while now, but it's one of the two of the first range of interviews that you did. And we were both very similar companies, but doing different things with different people. And there are a lot of synergies. So we brought together the companies last summer to create Graft. And we are predominantly a supplier to the on-trade with actually good presence with independent retail as well around the country. And we are broadly spread around the country. So we have people based up in Scotland. We have people in the Midlands. We have people in London, down in the South. So we aren't a particularly big presence in the industry, but we aren't one of the smallest either. So we're sort of stuck in the middle a little bit, or the bottom end of the middle tier. But around the same time as we merged, Red Squirrel was rated by Harper's Wine and Spirits magazine as the third best drink supplier in the UK, which was a really proud moment for me and our team. It was completely gobsmacking, actually, to be perfectly honest. It seemed bizarre to be put there in amongst or ahead of some absolute luminaries of the trade who've been around for decades. But I think the reason why we got voted that is we've always been pretty good at punching above our weight, making our voice heard despite being still a very small company. So people may have heard of Red Squirrel before, they may have heard of the Knotted Vine before, but the Graft Wine Company is now, I think, even better than both of those combined. We've got a great team, and we operate in most channels and markets around the UK. Red Squirrel does still exist as an online retail presence. It's always been a web shop. It's why I set up Red Squirrel in the first place before we pivoted towards supplying the trade. And we've kept that just ticking along in the background without really an awful lot of focus, because our predominant business is with the trade, whether that's indies or restaurants throughout the country. So it's just there in the background as something to allow for the members of the public to buy certain wines which actually maybe aren't available in independent retail, because we are predominantly serving restaurants. And we might see now in this uncertain age that side of the business has to become a little bit more important, but that's one of the number of plans we've got.
Okay. And, really before we kind of turned our mics on, because we are, needing to record this remotely, having contacted you on email in the last few days, I saw some of the videos that you were sharing on Facebook and across various platforms. Just, I think, talking to the supply chain, talking to, because, the current situation, I think the sort of the where it impacts the man, the woman on the street is kind of their local pub, restaurant, and bars, wine shops, etc. But I thought it was very enlightening to me, to think about the hidden side of that. I guess you were sort of really trying to shine a bit of a light on that. So I was wondering, what I think might be helpful is almost kind of to give almost again a little bit of a deep dive into the sort of the day-to-day. Just give us a sense of where do those sort of tentacles, if you like, spread on either side. How many people, what countries, the wines that you're selling coming from, and then a sense of, through those different touch points, Scotland, Midlands, London, South, how many sort of restaurants, bars, etc. are you then impacting and serving?
Yeah, it's a really difficult thing to answer about the supply chain at the moment, because essentially it's all still functioning. Wine is still able to come into us. We had a few hiccups in recent weeks with Italian wines, because big areas of Italy, particularly wine-growing areas of the northern regions of Italy, have been in lockdown, in red zones, in quarantine. So we have had a few hiccups, a few delays, but that hasn't actually ultimately stopped wine coming into the country. And that, I think, is the same for other regions of the world, whether it's Europe or even further afield. There are clearly restrictions now in place in most countries in the world, northern and southern hemispheres, but logistics is still ticking along. I don't know how long that will last. There will obviously be a logjam if indeed workforces are dwindling because people are getting ill or isolating. And actually we are hearing some reports that the shipping companies just cannot convince drivers to go to certain areas of northern Italy, for example, because a lot of the time when we're working with a shipping company in the UK, they are the people we do the business with, but they are contracting out services to people in local areas who might actually be subject to restrictions. So I think in time we will begin to see more and more difficulties in the supply chain into us. But for the moment, it's okay. And then if you look downstream from us to our customers, I mean, we're serving well over 200 small and medium and slightly larger businesses in every region of the UK now. And I would estimate that 70% of those are pure restaurants, for want of a better definition. Of course, some have a little bit of a shop element. People like the Vinotecas of this world or the Vagabonds and things, but basically they're pure on-trade premises, and they're now gone. So they're shut. So us as a part of the supply chain to them no longer exists. In the space of a few days, effectively 70 to 80% of our customer base has been closed down, either voluntarily initially or now actually just had to because the government's compelled them to. We've reached that point. However, there are still people who can stay open or they can adapt. They are proving amazingly resilient and flexible. It's been an extraordinary time in some ways. I think a lot of people are still going through various different stages of grief, ultimately, and there's an element of sort of post-trauma, I think, for some, which we're still working our way through. And there are independents around the country, maybe in less affected areas, but also restaurants who are now suddenly becoming takeaways. And I mean, quite frankly, takeaway is no longer that guilty thing you do on a Friday night because you've had a few and you can't be bothered to cook. You can now get takeaways from Michelin-star restaurants. I mean, it is going to be really an amazing time to eat at home if you've got those kind of restaurants on your doorstep for the next few weeks and few months. I mean, there is that, and seeing people adapt. So we would estimate, we'd estimate that actually 70 to 80% of our business, our revenue stream basically, has vanished. That means that the remainder is either independent wine shops who can to some extent stay open, whether that's just for takeaway, or collection or delivery services. And then there are still restaurants who are able to involve wine as part of their takeout or delivery service as well. And we've got some great friends and partners in the industry who are using our wines to accompany the meals that they're preparing for people to eat in their home. So there are bits of the restaurant business that we do that can sustain in the coming months, but it's pretty few and far between, and therefore I think for anyone in our position in the supply chain, it's independent retail that is going to be crucial in the coming months, if indeed business is going to be sustained at all. That there are people in our sphere who are entirely reliant on the restaurant industry, whether that's smaller competitors or much bigger competitors. I think we're fairly fortunate that about 1/3 of our business is already with independent retailers. So we're not brilliantly, diversified, but we're relatively well diversified. The only difficulty I think a lot of people will find in the coming months from our point of view, from the supplier's point of view, is that a lot of those independent retailers have spent the better part of the last decade diversifying themselves into things like drinking in, into becoming a hybrid wine bar come wine shop. And one element of that has now been pulled out from underneath them. So I think whichever way you look at it, our section of the supply chain is going to be drastically reduced for the foreseeable future. And there aren't many ways that you can make up that difference purely in the traditional model of supplying wine bars, restaurants and pubs and so forth, because there's only so much people will drink at home. But I don't know, hopefully we'll be proven wrong.
And this is it. I mean, there are obviously, so many sort of questions, and so I mean, I guess where my mind is sort of going to is really, I guess, you've got that contact, and you've already spoken already to Italy. I guess my mind really goes to the people there, and I don't know, is it possible to sort of get a sense even slightly further back down the line? I mean, you've spoken already the kind of the logistics element coming under strain in Italy, and still sort of able to function to a degree. I mean, are you having conversations with winemakers? I mean, are they sort of is it possible to get any sort of feel for how any of your producers are sort of viewing the situation, and how they're sort of feeling at this time?
Yes. Well, we are constantly talking to winemakers, and partly because they care, and we care, and this is affecting everyone in the world. Wherever you are, some places are obviously worse affected than others, and the UK and Western Europe seems to be the epicenter of it at the moment. But people are still subject to increasingly restrictive choices. I mean, people in Australia are already in effectively lockdown situations, restaurants and bars closing. One of my colleagues had to cancel a trip to South Africa a couple of weeks ago because South Africa has introduced some quite drastic measures, and our partners in wineries around the world are having to close their cellar doors, are having to restrict their contact with the public. So this is affecting everyone, and we are talking to each other. I think from a structural kind of business point of view, there will come a point where actually the whole thing does start potentially to break down if everyone isn't working together and supporting each other, and recognizing that we are in a global marketplace, particularly in the wine trade, where there is that upstream, downstream, from the likes of ourselves to the winemaker, wherever in the world they are, to the restaurant, which is now shut. And we have to recognize that if a supplier in our position has had 80% of their customer base close forcibly overnight, then that is going to cause serious log jams in doing business. Whether it's wine that needs to come in at some point or was expected to come in, but now there's no need for it, or whether it's wine that has recently come in, but there's not necessarily the revenue to pay for it, because this is the thing, you order, in our position, you order based on expected sales in the months ahead. And you'll typically try to hold, depending on the size of business, a certain number of months of stock. If it's coming from further afield, like Australia, then you will order maybe a little bit more. If it's coming from France, then you might order a bit less, and you order more regularly, and you can get away with that because it doesn't take very long. But you are still basing it on forecast sales. And up until a couple of weeks ago, maybe a month ago, we weren't really winding it down to the extent that, I don't know, hindsight's a beautiful thing, but you're still ordering fairly normally for the start of the year. And now you just can't, because we're looking at a situation of drastically reduced trading. So that kind of disconnect, that sudden disconnect, is going to cause problems very quickly for all sorts of importers. I think particularly of a bigger size, than perhaps for a smaller size like us. But we're heading into very uncharted territory, and I think as an entire hospitality industry, we're in a fight for our lives at the moment. Definitely.
Totally. And I guess, the pressing element in a situation like this, that is, that word unprecedented yet again, and just nobody knows, there's just so much change happening day to day, and we're almost in this fog, where we just can't see any distance ahead of us.
The biggest difficulty we face at the moment, and I think any importer will face, particularly someone in this very sensitive bit of a supply chain, is we don't know when this will end. All the indications might be from the more positive politicians that we might knock this on the head in 3 or 4 months. But then what? Do we prepare for a point in 3 or 4 months' time to suddenly have all this stock ready to go? Are the floodgates going to open when that point arrives? Are all the people who we know and care about in the restaurant trade just going to reopen their doors, snap their fingers, and customers reappear and life goes back to normal? We just don't know that. The real problem is whatever the support that the government can offer, and I mean it is unprecedented and enormous, the amount of support that the government has offered. I mean, I imagine a lot of people in the hospitality trade or, suppliers to it would have been like me and literally basically broke down when the Chancellor announced what they would do for wages. It's just going to save so many people's jobs, hopefully, and reduce anxiety in the short term. But we still have to have in the back of our mind that we don't know when this is going to end. And the government has effectively given an open-ended commitment. Yeah. To workers and to businesses, which of course is wonderful, but we still have to prepare for when we get back to it. Everyone's talking about, gosh, we're going to party like it's whatever, when you're first allowed to go back to the pub or back out to those restaurants you love, and we've got to be ready for that. Now, I don't know necessarily whether this is possible, but I hope maybe this is something the WSTA and other trade associations for other companies crucial to the supply chain, importing goods, particularly from around the world. It's whether there can be an ongoing dialogue with the government, not saying that we want a deadline, not saying that we absolutely have to have the date when things will reopen again, but just so that we get a heads up and we get maybe a little bit more privileged insight to the data and the modelling and their idea of how things are happening in real time. And maybe just to give us a month window. Doesn't have to be down to a matter of weeks, but just give us a month window. When do you think, within 4 to 6 weeks, when is this going to kick off again? When are we going to get back? And do you think that will be momentary? Do you think that within a matter of weeks, we are going to be back to the situation now we're closing restaurants because you have to keep turning the taps on and off until you can get to a point where a vaccine can do that for you? That's the dialogue we need to be having. And it's not about committing funds. I mean, it's incredibly well received and generous what the government is doing, but we now need to have a dialogue, because otherwise the supply chain won't be ready to catch up, and that will have its own economic consequences as well, because it means that we can't get back to normal quickly. So I would ask government bodies and trade associations, let's start that dialogue now so that the likes of ourselves, the employers, can really, really get a handle to the best possible extent on when we're going to come back to normal, because that will also help protect jobs. It really will. Paying people's wages it's unbelievable in so many ways, but it's brilliant. But how long for? You can only keep people furloughed for so long if you know that maybe in a month's time they're going to be actually doing something. You can actually start staffing your restaurant. You can start re-preparing menus. You can make sure you've got the waiting staff available, because these kind of people, you can't just click your fingers and they'll reappear. They might go home. They might be from abroad. I just don't know. I mean, it's something that hasn't really necessarily been thought through even in my own mind. But I do think logistics will play a massive part in getting this country back on its feet, and the supply chain will play a massive part in getting this country back on its feet. So we need to be involved with the thought process coming out of government as well.
Okay, and I think final question really, and I think maybe I like to end on a future-oriented note, and like to end on as positive note as possible. And I'm the sort of person I can always see a positive, 99.9% of the time. And I'm just curious. I don't know if we spoke about it, but I know we have mentioned before around just the amazing creativity, and you spoke about the resourcefulness of those restaurants kind of reinventing themselves, where overnight going from silver service to Deliveroo in the space of a week or so, which just got to sort of laugh or you'd cry at times like this. I'm curious, are you picking up from your staff or any kind of body in your network anything around the sort of skills that you think people might need, at this stage that perhaps there's a lot of potentially, with people, as you say, furloughed, there's potentially opportunity for people to study remotely, that I guess you wouldn't have had sort of 20, 30 years ago. And I'm just curious, there needn't be, but, is there something, an element, a theme, something that's coming forward in terms of what might be sort of crucial, skills for people to develop?
Absolutely. If you take away the very big, real and present challenge of revenue, and ultimately a business lives and dies on its revenue or its capital, there are so many positives to this period that businesses or indeed just individuals and families can take advantage of. I mean, I'm sat here at home and will be for the foreseeable future with a 4.5-year-old who should be in school but is now being homeschooled. I'm now a teacher, and that's going to present its own challenges, but it's actually going to be a huge amount of fun. And I'm going to spend more time with my family. We've got a 2-month-old as well, and we're going to spend more time as a family unit. Yeah, we won't see grandparents. It kills me that my son won't see his friends. But there's a lot to be positive about. Sorry. But then from a company point of view, there are things you can catch up on. There's things people can learn. You can go back to school in some senses. Yeah, really dig into that producer that you never quite understood, that wine region you never quite understood. Go away and brush up on your French or whatever it is. We'll have time perhaps to do this and reskill in even some ways. I've got a customer down in Dorset who runs a bar which is having to close, and their general manager is suddenly becoming this sort of e-commerce whiz by revamping their website so that people can click and collect and things like that. And who knows, when we get out of this, well, not who knows, I'm adamant that when we get out of this, we will be a stronger business for it, because we will use this time, and I know so many other people will as well, we will use this time to become, I hope, better people and ultimately better at what we do, and maybe take a step back and reevaluate what matters, and that it's not all about rushing around and going at 1 million miles an hour. And maybe we can achieve just as much by going a bit slower. I don't know. We'll have to see if I'm still positive or as positive about that in a few months' time, and see if my son can still count. But if you remove the obvious hardships and the obvious challenges, if you can't feel alive right now, when can you? I mean, there's so much to throw oneself into. There's so much opportunity to make a mark and make yourself count for others. So yeah, I just know that we as an industry will do that.
Thank you so much, Nick. It was an absolute pleasure remotely sitting down with you. I look forward to clinking glasses with you in real life sometime soon. I've left below the websites for both Red Squirrel Wine and Graft Wine, so do be sure to check those out. now that Interpreting Wine has gone online for the time being. This means that anybody within the world of hospitality is within my reach. So do please either put yourself forward if you've got a story that you'd like to share, or feel free to nominate somebody that you think I should be interviewing. All the usual channels are still open. I'm at Interpreting Wine on Instagram and Facebook, at Wine Podcast on Twitter, and of course email hello@interpretingwine.com. Stay safe, stay indoors, and see you soon.